So although it may not look like it at first, this piece here is one of the filthiest pieces of furniture I've ever worked on. But under all those years of dirt and grime is actually a super rare mid-century secretary desk just waiting to shine again. Structurally it looks okay, and I'm hoping that the dirt isn't hiding any nasty surprises for me, but like I always say, there's only one way to find out. The design here is Arne Hovmand Olsen for Mogens Kold in Denmark, and because of the superior build quality and the fact that there are so few of these things around, they do hold a higher market value, which makes them worth investing some time into. Along with these stylized drawer pulls, it features the iconic floating base effect, where the main body of the desk is sort of suspended in the air above this really elegant solid teak leg assembly, and so I'm already getting excited to see what this thing is going to look like when it's been restored. We've also got this really thick edge banding on the front leading edges, which is a nice change because in the past this is an area where I've always had to spend a lot of time on repairs. The drawers are made from a combination of solid teak and mahogany in the traditional Danish style, and the main body panels are made from plywood as opposed to pressed wood, and so this is premium quality Danish modern. And although I don't know the exact year it was produced, I would guess earlier in the mid-century design era, so maybe mid to late 1950s. What I'd like to show in this video is that restoration doesn't always have to be about the most dramatic transformations. Often it's about paying attention to the smaller details, which may not be obvious at first, but which all add up in the end. This leg assembly is one example. It looks fine and it's stable enough, but it's wobbling and creaking and I don't know why. So I'm going to take it apart and have a closer look at it once the refinish is underway. Before I start with the paint stripper though, I want to remove this dried glue from the interior surface. I've got the hot air gun turned up to 100%, which should melt the glue again and make it a little easier to remove. I did try scrubbing with some solvents on the less dirty areas of the desk, but it really didn't do much, and so I'm just going to go ahead and cover everything with paint stripper inside and out. The one drawback of restoring these secretary desks is that the interiors tend to have a lot of small compartments and tight corners and stuff like that, which makes them difficult to strip and refinish. And so even though this one here is actually more of a larger kind of open plan interior, it's still going to be a messy and time-consuming job getting all of that dirt and paint stripper back out of there again. Because the veneer is so dirty, I'll leave this stripper to soak in for about 30 minutes before I start pulling it off again. Because this piece would have originally been finished with oil rather than lacquer, what happens with so many pieces from this era is they just get oiled and oiled over and over again. And so all the decades of dirt and grime just gets pushed further and further into the pores of the wood grain. Once I've removed as much as I can using the spatula, I'll use paper towels, solvents and wet wipes to clean everything off as much as possible. As I mentioned at the start though, this thing is deceptively dirty, and so it took a lot of scrubbing and wiping, and even now after all that cleaning, the surface is still pretty dirty. And after letting it dry off overnight, we can really see how much oil, dirt and grime there is still sitting in the pores of the wood grain. This is what you'd expect if it had been covered in lacquer or varnish, and although I think it's been sanded or refinished once, it's clearly been hit hard with oil or cheap furniture polishes and whatever else to get this dirty. What I can do to help further clean the wood though is to give it some treatment with the steam iron. This is something you would normally use to lift out dents or scratches, but it also helps to pull out a lot of the oils and contaminants from deeper within the wood grain. The legs do have some dents and scratches, which I will try to work out with the iron though, although in the end it will probably just come down to sanding them out. What's interesting is that the reason they were wobbling and creaking was because the spreaders are connected to the assembly with these screw lock type fittings, which you would normally see on flat pack furniture and stuff like that. I don't know why they chose to use this type of mechanism on this particular joint, but I should be able to tighten the joint by simply tightening the screws. Before I leave everything to dry off, I'm going to go around and fill out the larger dents with instant epoxy. These are dents which are too deep to steam out and too large to fill out with regular wood filler, whereas the epoxy offers a hard and durable material that's easy to sand smooth. I'd normally start with P150 on a project like this, but because some of the veneer is looking a little patchy, I'm going to start with 180 and see how it goes. It'll take a little longer to lift that top layer off, but there's less risk of blowing through the veneer or creating flat patch. I always try to leave as much texture and definition in the veneer as possible, and so I prefer to be cautious in situations like this where the thickness and integrity of the veneer is not 100% clear. For solid wood sections like the legs here, I'll start with P120, then move to P180 before finishing with a P180 sanding sponge, basically to avoid creating edges and flat patches and retain the original curves and contours as much as possible. As always, the final sand for this piece will be a P180, and although I can obviously use the machine for the larger open areas, most of the work on this piece is hand sanding all of these little compartments and corners. It is definitely a huge investment of additional time and energy, but I just personally feel that the job's not done properly unless the inside looks as good as the outside, especially when it comes to rare designer pieces like this one. Before I move on to the finishing though, I want to put the leg assembly back together so that I can reattach it. With this screw lock system, I should be able to solve the wobbling and creaking by simply tightening the screws. I still think this is a weird place to have this type of fitting, but I do want to keep everything original, so I'm not going to glue it or add anything to it. But because of its age though, the teak is still quite patchy, and so I'm going to use some teak oil to darken and rejuvenate it a little bit. This product is typically something you would use for outdoor teak furniture to stop it from drying out and going grey, but it's also perfect for the situation as well because it's really giving the timber a more fresh and consistent look. For the rest of the piece, I'm actually doing something a little bit different because instead of using my regular heavy-duty wood stain, I'm going to use some pigment and furniture oil instead. It's from the same manufacturer and it's a product I've used before, and I just found that while the solvent-based outdoor stains that I would normally use are great for getting a strong color tone, you do tend to lose some of the natural contrast and nuance, whereas I found this oil to just be a little warmer and softer looking. Now that it's drying, you can really see the softer, more mellow appearance of this oil, and so now I can move on to laying on the top coat with wipe-on poly. This is a product I've been using more and more lately because the warm satin variant offers the hardness and durability of polyurethane, but with a really warm, natural look. In other words, it doesn't look like polyurethane. If you use it sparingly and allow it to sink into the wood grain, it looks a lot more like Danish oil or a hard wax oil, and so you get that really warm and natural appearance. All that being said though, I think I'm still using too much of it, because even though my workshop can get pretty cold and damp in the winter, this stuff is supposed to be touch dry in a few hours, whereas the first coat here was still sticky after 24 hours, and so I had to take it down the hall and let it dry off in a friend's workshop, which is much warmer and drier than mine. Before I apply the second coat though, I need to scrub everything down with a Scotch Brite pad. This is really just an alternative to sanding, because all I'm really trying to do here is remove any bits of dust and dirt that might have dried into the finish. Between coats of poly, I also need to touch up the areas where I've filled out those little cavities and dents with epoxy. This work is always trial and error, and all I'm really doing is experimenting with a combination of marker pens and blend all sticks to get the best color match I can. My experience has been that regardless of what you're using, whether it be paint, pens or crayons, it will always look different from different angles, and so absolute perfection is never the goal. Now that it's ready for the final top coat, I'm really just going to be wiping on the absolute minimum amount possible. I don't want it getting too thick or shiny, and so this is really just to even out the coverage so that it's even and consistent. Storing it in the other workshop has definitely paid off too, because the second coat dried overnight, and so now I'm able to move on to the final sand. I'm using 320 grit sanding sponge here, which is my personal favorite for this stage of a project, because it really cuts down the sheen and evens everything out without creating streaks or marks, or basically just over sanding, which can cause problems later on when it comes to waxing and polishing. I'm using orange oil and beeswax polish on this piece because of the natural satin sheen it will create on a piece like this. For most situations, the rule of thumb is to use as little as possible and stretch it out as far as it will go. There have been some jobs where I found I had to add a little more, but most of the time, the more you stretch it out, the cleaner the result you'll get. And of course, I'll always buff out any excess after about 20 minutes or so. But if I've done it correctly and sparingly, then there really isn't much to buff out, and so what I'm doing is really just polishing it. With all the polishing done, I can now sand and oil the drawers. This is something I always leave until the end once all the finishing and waxing is done, because then there's no risk of the sanded areas getting dirty again. For a piece like this, with solid mahogany drawers, it's really worth it too, because it means that even the drawers themselves can become a highlight or a feature. I'll also paint some orange oil and beeswax polish on the sides of the drawers to act as a lubricant, but also to keep them looking a little more vibrant. And yes, I'm not going to lie, I am starting to run out of time. The goal was to finish this project and the video before Christmas, but my problems with the finish not drying really set everything back a few days, and so now it's really been a race to get this thing done before Christmas so that I can finally take a little bit of time off. In the end though, it came out great, and although it's perhaps not the most dramatic transformation I've ever done, I'm happy with the choices I made and with the way it looks now. If you've made it this far and you want to support the channel, please do like and subscribe. Until next time though, I'd like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.